I want to talk about social media and you're quoting Monk, the rise of a popularized version of the identity synthesis that transformed the ideas of serious thinkers, he's probably thinking of Foucault, into simplistic memes and slogans.
Yes. Um, what's the question? In that, like, what?
I want to know how that works. I mean, what's happened? So you have figures like Edward Said and Foucault and others, but it's the reductionism, the how they're very complex, often, and especially with Edward, nuanced ideas are reduced to a simplistic formula to serve woke culture.
Yeah. Well, I mean that happens. I don't think that Monk's account of that is particularly good. All of the academics, take up this case against post-structuralism, and I mean they have a point. I mean, what happens? But the thing they leave out is the following: what happens simultaneously with the arrival of post-structuralism from Europe in the late 70s, early 80s. Simultaneously, there is the legacy of McCarthyism, right? In the background of all this has to be understood the impact of the Red Scare. Taft-Hartley. So in the second half of this article, which I'm working on now, which is almost done, I get into the role of Taft-Hartley. This is very important. This is Taft-Hartley not just doesn't just weaken organized labor in a quantitative sense, but also qualitatively undermines all sorts of practices of solidarity that help build class consciousness.
Let,
We
let me
then,
just let me just interrupt to explain.
yeah,
This is the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act, which essentially prohibits any kind of sympathy strike. It absolutely cripples the ability of striking workers to have any kind of impact.
right, boycotts, sympathy strikes, these kinds of things. Communists are purged from the CIO. You've got the Smith Act, where socialist politicians are actually prosecuted. You've got McCarthyism and the Red Scare, and this continues on. You've got then the blossoming of this kind of radicalism of the New Left, but pretty quickly thereafter, there is very serious red baiting all the way through. There's red baiting within the universities, and lots of Marxists lose their jobs in university. And so what happens is that this new radical theory from Europe arrives, which is a reaction, for example, from the pen of Foucault. I mean, Foucault is a member of the French Communist Party for a while, but in the 50s, the French Communist Party was hegemonic among intellectuals, and it didn't always have good ideas, and it had a kind of bureaucratized culture, and there's plenty about that project to critique. And so Foucault is part of a generation of left intellectuals who become increasingly anti-communist while promoting new kinds of radicalism. And so that's what Foucault is taken up for in the US and others, right? And so, like, as a vacuum is created by the continued red baiting and blacklisting of professors. My father was one of these people. He was, Yale educated PhD, and went and you know was treated very well until in the 60s his students started radicalizing him, and he became a radical and a Marxist, and thereafter found it very, very hard to get and keep jobs. A lot of Marxists had this experience.
And let me
And
just interject there that you're talking about Michael Parenti. Your father's
yes,
also written several great books. But Ellen Schrecker has done, if you want to read about the history of
yeah,
how brutal these purges were, right down to the high school level,
yep,
where
no
the
Ivy
FBI would
Costa.
show up at a high school with a list and no questions asked, no evidence. Suddenly, not only did all of those teachers lose their jobs, but they couldn't get hired anywhere else.
Yep,
That's a moment in American
absolute
history that's
liars.
extremely important. And Ellen Schrecker wrote two good books, No Ivory Tower and Such Were the Crimes, I think is the name of the other one. But
Yeah,
she's chronicled that history. And I didn't know how pervasive that blacklisting was until I read those books.
yeah. So that creates an atmosphere of hostility and a vacuum, and then into it come these enticing new ideas about how, well, there's a different kind of revolution and radicalism that that focuses on the micropolitics of resistance and the politics of identity, et cetera, et cetera. And part of the critique that makes this post-structuralist wave so appealing is that, so, we'll look at what Foucault's argument is that Marxism is this incredibly powerful theory, and it's essentially the height of the Enlightenment and Western metaphysics, and it nonetheless, in the hands of the Soviet state, helps produce the gulags, right? So the problem is making any kind of sweeping truth claims, and so you have to push back against that and kind of want to like shatter shatter epistemology and knowledge into smaller pieces. And this became very useful and very appealing to academics because it was a way of being radical, a way of being subversive, and also a way of speaking to real problems. There really is racism. There really is sexism, right? Disabled people really are mistreated and shunned, right? So you can talk about real problems and be radical and propose radical transformations without confronting the class hierarchy of the society, which is, where the power really lies. It's not that these other issues aren't important. They are. But it's like, in most cases, the solutions to those problems require the redistribution of resources, which only comes when the ruling class, the capitalist class, the owning class are confronted, right? And so post-structuralism allows academics to pursue a kind of left politics that minimizes, in some cases, is even openly hostile to a class analysis and to class struggle. A lot of this story comes down to detaching class struggle from cultural struggles. And what woke is the continuation of all of the goals of the Enlightenment left, but in the realm of culture war, in the realm of cultural struggles. And that material conflict is increasingly elided and erased.
And isn't it done through the twin evils of relativism and subjectivity?
Yeah, I'm not sure I would call them evils. Because but those are the methods for sure. It's like, so, yeah, the question becomes subjectivity, and a kind of moral relativism is introduced, which is, at first glance, it's about undermining the 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 bigoted ideologies that had dominated in the West, and say, well, no, it's like there's all sorts of different ways of being, and homosexuality is not a mental illness, right? And everyone deserves full civil rights, right? So there's some important work that's done by relativism. Say, well, just because your worldview is such that you think this is a sin doesn't mean you're right. You just have a point of view, and there are all sorts of other points of view. So I think there's something useful in that, but it is deployed to undermine the Marxist socialist tradition. Say, well, that's it's reductive. It's this meta theory, and it's essentialist, and we want to explode things and be more playful than that. And in terms of the subjectivity, yes, that's huge. And another part of that, kind of what goes with subjectivity, is the therapeutic turn. And that's something that's in the second part of the essay, right? You have, at the end of World War II, most psychologists and psychiatrists work in institutions, but there's a massive deinstitutionalization of the profession prior to the deinstitutionalization of the patients that happens in the 70s and 80s. But there's a deinstitutionalization of psychology, and post-war psychology turns away from just dealing with crippling mental illness, and it starts trying to heal regular people and find pathology everywhere. And there's an explosion of this stuff, and you see it taking on a rather malign form, unfortunately, in the New Left. This is the second half of this essay, which is not published yet, but you get the rise of these politicized therapy groups. There's one I've written about elsewhere called reevaluation counseling, which comes out of this guy Harvey Jackins, who was one of the founders actually of Scientology. He was sued by L. Ron Hubbard for stealing a lot of Hubbard's ideas. And reevaluation counseling is still very big on the left. It's associated from 1971 onward, increasingly with the Movement for a New Society, which is a group of comes out of sort of like Quaker movements, and they are they uh, advocate collective living, and they're very, very involved in the Movement for a New Society. Is very, very involved in the anti-nuke struggles and the Central American solidarity struggles, and then the anti-globalization struggles. And then they disband, but their influence is still there in this kind of anti-communist but very radical, quasi-anarchist but detached from the traditional anarchist theories. And they are all also very influenced by Gene Sharp, who is the one of the best known proponents of revolutionary nonviolence. But unlike King and Gandhi, he's secular. He doesn't have like a religious cosmology and morality driving him. His approach to revolutionary nonviolence is very technocratic, and he's actually spends the first 30 years of his career at a Defense Department funded think tank. He is not necessarily directly funded by the Defense Department, but this think tank at Harvard called the Center for International Affairs. When he arrives there, Henry Kissinger is one of the co-directors, and and the U.S. defense establishment uses Sharp's ideas to basically build out the color revolution toolkit, right? So those same kind of ideas are increasingly permeating the new left. Reevaluation counseling is just one example of this stuff. These encounter groups, like the radical women's liberation movement in the late '60s, began these encounter groups, and you know, Cesar Chavez famously gets wrapped up with one of these kinds of like basically cults, Synanon. So subjectivity becomes a battleground for the left, and from the '60s on, it's seen that individual subjectivity is in many ways the path forward for larger social change. You could argue that it's the other way around, you know, that people's subjectivity changes when the structures they're embedded in change. I mean, of course, it's a bit of both, but you know, anyway. So that that whole psychological turn within the society and then within the new left is a very important part of the origins of woke.